The silence was never supposed to break, but now, according to Tom Bauer, it finally has, and not quietly, not safely, but through a crack in the very system designed to keep everything hidden. An alleged NDA breach that threatens to rip open the carefully polished fairy tale of Meghan's royal wedding and expose what he claims were the truths nobody was ever meant to hear. Because here's what makes this moment feel different. This isn't just another recycled rumor, another whisper from the shadows. This is being framed as a collapse of control, a signed silence, suddenly undone. And if even a fraction of it is real, then the story people thought they knew about, that globally televised wedding, starts to look less like a celebration and more like a stage-managed illusion that was already cracking behind the scenes. According to the narrative now building, the alleged NDA wasn't just any document, it was reportedly part of a tightly controlled system surrounding staff, planners, insiders, people who were close enough to see what cameras never showed. And for years, those voices stayed quiet. Locked, sealed, untouchable, until now, until something or someone decided to break that silence. And when that silence breaks, it doesn't come out clean. It comes out messy, fragmented, uncomfortable, because the version being pushed now suggests that what happened behind those palace walls in the months leading up to the wedding was not the seamless, magical preparation the world was shown, but something far more tense, far more controlled, and far more strategic than anyone realized. There were already whispers that never fully went away. Claims that Meghan approached everything with precision, with intention, with a level of control that clashed with centuries of royal tradition. Claims that staff felt overwhelmed, that plans kept shifting, that nothing was ever quite settled. And now, with this alleged NDA break hanging over everything, those whispers are being reframed as something bigger, something that was never supposed to leave the room. And suddenly, the old questions come back stronger than ever. Was this really a love story unfolding naturally, or was it something more calculated from the very beginning? Because even back then, there were claims, controversial, uncomfortable claims, that Meghan had already positioned herself for a certain life, a certain level, a certain kind of partner. That when Prince Harry entered the picture, it wasn't just romance, it was timing. And if that perspective is now being echoed by voices allegedly freed from NDAs, then it shifts everything. It suggests that what people dismissed as harsh opinion might have been observations from inside the room. The idea that she didn't know much about the royal family, that narrative now feels like it's under direct attack again. Because what's being implied now is not just curiosity, but preparation, research, strategy, a deep understanding of what she was stepping into long before the world believed she even cared. And then there's the fracture, the slow, quiet distancing that reportedly began even before the wedding. Harry's circle, his friends, the people who had always been there. Those moments, once brushed off as minor disagreements or cultural differences, now look different under this new lens. Because if insiders are speaking, even indirectly, it suggests those tensions weren't isolated. They were patterns, repeating, building. And it didn't stop there. Even the pre-wedding events, the gatherings that were supposed to bring everyone together, are now being re-examined. Behavior, reactions, complaints, small details that didn't seem important at the time now being pulled back into focus as pieces of a much larger picture. And then comes the part that many people remember but perhaps never fully understood. The family situation, the chaos, the absence, a father who didn't attend, a royal family quietly trying to manage a situation that was spiraling in public view. At the time, it was seen as unfortunate, messy, complicated. But now, with this alleged NDA breach narrative, it's being framed as something deeper, something that insiders may have seen differently than what was presented to the world. And that's where the tension truly starts to build. Because if people who were once bound to silence are now speaking, or hinting, or leaking, then it raises a question that refuses to go away. What else was happening that day that the world never saw? What conversations took place behind closed doors? What disagreements were quietly contained? What compromises were made just to keep everything moving forward toward that single perfect moment broadcast to millions? And perhaps most unsettling of all, who decided it was time for that silence to end? Because NDAs don't just break on their own, they break when something shifts, when pressure builds, when someone decides that staying quiet is no longer worth it. And if that's what's happening now, then this may not be the end of the story. It may just be the beginning of everything that was never supposed to come out. And just when it feels like the story has already gone too far to get any darker, the narrative takes another turn. Because what's now being suggested is that this alleged NDA breach didn't just expose tensions, it exposed intent. And that's where everything becomes far more uncomfortable, far more personal, and far more explosive than anything that came came before. Because if the whispers are to be believed, then the wedding wasn't just a moment of union, it was a moment of positioning, a carefully constructed stage where every detail, every guest, every visual, every narrative thread was allegedly being shaped not just for tradition, but for something much bigger, something long-term, something that extended far beyond the palace gates and into a future that, at the time, nobody openly questioned. The guest list itself suddenly starts to look different under this light. No longer just a mix of royal protocol and celebrity sparkle, but a calculated network, a room filled with influence, connections, future leverage, the kind of room you don't just walk into by accident, but one you build, piece by piece with intention. And if insiders are now hinting that this wasn't coincidence, then it reframes the entire spectacle into something far more strategic than sentimental. And then there's the growing focus on control, because that word keeps resurfacing over and over again, like a shadow that refuses to disappear. Control over image, control over narrative, control over how every moment would be remembered long after the ceremony ended. And if what's being implied is true, then the real battle wasn't happening in public at all. It was happening quietly behind the scenes, where tradition met resistance, where centuries-old expectations collided with a modern, uncompromising vision that refused to bend. Staff reportedly felt it, that pressure, that constant shifting of expectations, the sense that nothing was ever quite final, that everything could change at a moment's notice. And now, with this alleged NDA breach, those feelings are no longer just internal frustrations, they're being reframed as part of a larger pattern that suggests the wedding wasn't running smoothly behind the curtain at all, but was instead being held together by sheer force of will and relentless direction. And then comes one of the most sensitive layers of all, the comparisons, the echoes of Princess Diana, the narrative that began to form during the engagement and intensified during the wedding itself, a narrative that some insiders reportedly found deeply uncomfortable, even inappropriate, because it wasn't just about honoring a legacy, it was about aligning with it, stepping into it, almost rewriting it in real time. And if voices tied to these NDAs are now suggesting that this was encouraged, reinforced, even strategically used, then it opens up an entirely new level of controversy that goes far beyond wedding drama and into something much more emotionally charged within the royal family itself. Because once you introduce legacy into the equation, once you bring Diana into the conversation, everything becomes heavier, more sensitive, more dangerous. And if that boundary was blurred behind the scenes, then it's no surprise tensions would rise in ways the public could never fully see. And yet, perhaps the most unsettling implication of all comes from what this alleged NDA break suggests about the future that followed. Because if the wedding itself was already being shaped with a certain level of long-term thinking, then it raises a question that feels almost too bold to ask. Was the exit always part of the plan? Were the seeds of stepping away, of building a separate identity, of transitioning into a completely different world already being planted during those very moments that the world was celebrating as the beginning of a lifelong royal chapter? Because looking back now through the lens of these claims, through the lens of what Tom Bower has been insisting all along, the patterns begin to align in a way that feels less like coincidence and more like design. A gradual movement from royal integration to independent branding, from palace life to global media deals, from tradition to transformation. And if insiders are now even subtly confirming that this trajectory was visible from the beginning, then it completely reshapes how that wedding is remembered. It stops being just a ceremony and starts looking like a launch point, a pivot, a carefully timed moment that opened doors far beyond what anyone publicly acknowledged at the time. And then there's Harry, standing at the center of it all, a figure who, according to these ongoing narratives, was not just participating but protecting, shielding, defending at every step, sometimes even against his own family, his own circle, his own history. And if what's being suggested is true, then that protection may have come at a cost far greater than anyone realized in the moment, because loyalty, when pushed to extremes, can isolate, it can divide, it can redraw lines that were never meant to be crossed. And that's where the story stops feeling like gossip and starts feeling like something else entirely, something more layered, more complicated, more unresolved. Because even now, even after everything that has happened since, even after the move, the interviews, the public statements, the shifting roles, this alleged NDA breach brings everything back to that single single moment in time and asks one haunting question that refuses to settle. What if the truth of that wedding was never what it seemed? Not because people didn't look closely enough, but because they were never meant to see it in the first place. And if that's the case, then this isn't just a story about the past being revealed, it's a story about how much of it is still waiting to come out, how many voices are still silent, how many details are still locked away, and whether this so-called breach is just the first crack in, something far bigger that could change the entire narrative all over again.